Hi guys, this is Tim Williams. Welcome to an episode of Revealing Your Vision. Please visit our club website, notchabovephoto.com, or join us at one of our monthly meetings in the beautiful North Country of New Hampshire's White Mountains. I primarily shoot landscape photos, and I make custom prints of my best photographs because for me this is a worthwhile endpoint. But to be honest, what I enjoy most is post-processing. Done properly, it enables me to turn a so-so photo, which I admit is all too common, into something special. For today's topic, is there a recipe for post-processing? I'll begin telling you why I'm using ON1 Photo RAW. Then we'll explore some of the concepts behind revealing your vision, before I share my initial steps in post-processing a landscape image. A subsequent episode of Revealing Your Vision, Beyond the Recipe, delves into the more artistic aspects of post-processing, with a side excursion into black and white. So sit back and relax as you take in my comments. My intention is to provide content for the beginner to intermediate photographer in an easy-to-understand, step-by-step approach. You may not agree with everything I say or do, but I hope these videos will encourage discussion. Post your remarks on YouTube, as well as suggestions for future topics. I use Adobe Lightroom CC and Adobe Photoshop as well, but with the latest upgrades of ON1 Photo RAW, we now have a more inclusive program than Lightroom, and a program that's much easier to learn than Photoshop. In fact, with this latest version, ON1 seems to be moving successfully towards a do-it-all approach. It encompasses file management, basic development in post, numerous filters or effects, layers, and probably the easiest masking tools anywhere, and all of this with non-destructive editing of raw files. In version 2018.1, we finally get soft-proofing as well, for those of us who believe in the value of custom printing. You can also enlarge and print from within ON1 RAW, although still on my wish list is a more robust print module that allows you to create layouts as with Lightroom. Here are 4 basic concepts behind revealing your photographic vision. First, it's your vision. What is your vision? Well, in short, it should be how you remember the scene when you took the photograph. And to be clear, it's not just what your eyes saw, but also what you felt, the mood, what made it special, why you took the photograph in the first place. This means that it's up to you to interpret the scene, and it's okay if your interpretation differs from mine or the next person. I can hear some protests already, and that brings me to the second concept. There are some elements of post-processing that are like a recipe. Now the protests are getting louder, and as many of you know, there are simply just some guidelines, can I say rules, that should be followed. For instance, do basic tone adjustments and color correction before getting creative. Thou shalt not oversaturate thine images. Crunchies are great for snacking, but take care to avoid crunchy images from over-sharpening or excessive application of filters like dynamic contrast. Thou shalt crop out or erase distracting elements. Remove noise, if you shot with a high ISO, before sharpening, unless you like sharp noise. Vignettes should be subtle, unless you intend otherwise. I could go on, but you get the idea, and we'll talk about these and other issues as we take today's image into post. For now, think about an actual cake recipe. You add the eggs to the flour, and not the other way around. At least, I think you do. I'm not a great cook. But the icing on the cake is left more to your discretion, which brings me to the next concept. Fortunately, there are many elements of post-processing that are not like a recipe. These are the creative or artistic elements, and these elements generally follow tone and color correction. The former are the more technical aspects of your post-processing. The artistic elements are where you reveal your vision of the original scene. As a side note, I shoot mainly in RAW because RAW files give you more latitude in post-processing and contain more information than JPEGs do. But there's an even more important reason. With a JPEG, your camera bakes in its own interpretation, and although some cameras have very good JPEG processing options, Fujifilm X cameras for instance, I prefer to bake my own cake and reveal my own vision. So here's a final concept. When you're doing post-processing or watching a video about post-processing, for the most part the numbers on the sliders are not what's important. What is important is deciding what you want to do, pre-visualizing the image you want, and understanding the steps to accomplish that vision. You will learn what your post-processing software can and cannot do, and which tools to use where. So enough theory for now. Let's get to the actual post-processing I promised you. As we progress, I'll explain my thinking and why I choose to do each step. And because the responsiveness of this video depends on your internet speed, I'll move the sliders back and forth more slowly than I would if I were just editing the photo for myself. Here we are in the Browse module of ON1 Photo Raw 2018. And I'm looking at some of the photos that my wife and I took in Holland and Norway in 2016. The photograph we're going to be working on today is the image in the lower right-hand corner of this screenshot, a Nikon RAW file. I'm going to double-click on the image to bring it up closer to fit in view. And then I'll simply go over to the icon in the lower left-hand corner and click on that to hide the left-hand panel of the browser. This is an unretouched raw photo that I shot near a village called Zaanschans in Holland. As you can see from the EXIF data in the right-hand panel, the scene was captured on a Nikon D7100 at 1/400th of a second at f/14 in aperture priority mode, and the ISO speed was set to 320. The lens was a Tamron SP-AF 17-50 f2.8, and it was zoomed to 32 millimeters. I like the overall composition, but I want to get rid of that distracting tuft of grass in the lower right and crop out some of the water. At the same time, I can see by looking at the photo that it needs more dynamic range. Sure enough, looking at the histogram in the upper right-hand corner reveals limited tones in the darkest blacks on the left of the histogram and the brightest whites on the right. I also want to accentuate the wispy clouds and bring out more detail in the buildings. Making the windmills a bit brighter will also help to draw the viewer's attention, as will a vignette applied at the end. And even though there is some interesting local color, in the back of my mind I'm beginning to think this might make an even more compelling black and white image because of the contrasting textures, as well as the potential to further develop the tones in the sky and reflections in the water. So now that I have pre-visualized the scene as I remembered it, I'm ready to begin revealing my vision. My first step, while still in the Browse module, is to press the G key to go back to grid view, and then right-click on this image and select Create Version to make a virtual copy. This way I can easily go back to the original if I decide to try another approach to processing while still retaining my current work in the virtual copy. Since we're working on a raw file in ON1, all of my edits will be non-destructive. And making a virtual copy doesn't take up any more space on my solid-state drive because all of the information about this copy is stored as instructions in the original sidecar file rather than creating a new file. Now I click on the virtual copy we made and take it into the Develop module for some basic adjustments to tone. The first thing I'm going to do is check if the overall exposure is sufficient to see and edit the elements of the photo. Exposure looks okay for now, but if it were too dark I could temporarily increase the exposure slightly. This step may not be necessary for every photo, and when it is, you would very likely come back to make further adjustments later. Which brings up an important tip. Many of your steps in post-processing will be iterative in the sense that after you make an additional adjustment elsewhere, you may find it necessary to go back and tweak an earlier one. Now I'm going to scroll down to the lens correction panel here and make sure that my lens is correctly entered to correct any distortions. And I see in fact that it's showing a Tamron SPAF 17-50 f2.8 lens, which is the lens I was using. If this were not correct, here's where I would make the new entry. There don't seem to be any chromatic aberrations along the contrasty edges in the magnified view that I looked at earlier. But if there were, I would click on the Manual tab just below, right here, and I would play with the purple or green sliders to get rid of the chromatic aberrations. So now let's crop this image using the crop tool in the upper left-hand margin. Go over here to the crop tool, click on it, and go down to the bottom of the crop tool, and I'm simply going to click and drag until the bottom portion comes up above that tuft of grass on the lower right-hand side that I wanted to get rid of. I'm taking care to still preserve the reflections in the water. The horizon appears level, but if not, I would click on the level tool at the top, right there, and drag a line on an edge I know to be horizontal. Clicking on Apply completes the crop, but like all non-destructive edits, this is reversible. Now I want to show you two important settings in the Preferences file. I go up to the Edit menu, drop that down, and click Preferences. And the first setting is right here under General, and that's Scrolling Controls, and I have it set to brush size. You'll see in a minute why this is extremely helpful. The other setting is under Files, and that's down under Sidecar Options. I would highly recommend that you turn on Save ON1 Sidecar Files for non-destructive edits and metadata. Before we go too much further, let's get rid of two pesky dust spots in the sky on either side of the windmill in the foreground, since they're really bugging me. I'll use the Perfect Eraser tool over on the left. And I will adjust the brush size either using the bracket keys on my keyboard. The left bracket will shrink the brush size. Let me bring it down here so you can see it. And the right bracket key will increase the bracket size. However, because I set scrolling to control brush size in the preferences, I can simply use the scroll wheel on my mouse to very conveniently adjust this brush size. I'm going to bring the Perfect Eraser over, adjust it so that it's just slightly larger than the dust size, and simply click once. Wait a second, and that dust spot is gone. Now I'll mouse over to this other dust spot and do the same thing. Neat. Noise reduction is next, though there shouldn't be much noise since I shot this photo at a relatively low ISO of 320. I'll click up at the top to zoom into 100%. By the way, if you don't see the various zoom settings up at the top after using a tool like the Perfect Eraser, just go over to the left-hand tool wheel and click on View instead, and those various magnifications will suddenly appear at the top. So I've zoomed into 100%, and using the nav panel on the right, I can drag the view box around to view first the sky and then some shadow areas. Both are good places to see noise if there is any. I don't see much, but I'm going to tweak the color noise slider slightly anyway. and then the luminance noise slider, just to be on the safe side. So let's hide the lens correction panel by clicking on that little word hide there, and we'll open the details panel by clicking on show. And then if we scroll down, we'll see first the noise reduction for luminance, and then below that the noise reduction for color. I don't want to go too far on either adjustment because that would blend out some of the detail that's important in the picture. So we'll just crank up the color to about 23 or so, crank up the luminance to about 25 or 27, and that should do it. You'll notice that I've also boosted the detail sliders just a little bit to recover any detail that the noise reduction might otherwise erase. Resetting the exposure if necessary by double-clicking on the slider title here, I first want to maximize my dynamic range by properly setting the white and black points. I do this while holding down the J key to watch for any signs of clipping, areas of pure white or pure black with no detail. Holding the J key and moving the white slider to the right, I adjust until clipping just starts to appear as red areas, which you can see in the middle windmill here, and then backing off. Then I do the same, moving the black slider to the left, holding down the J key and watching for blue areas, as you see under the dock here, and then backing off on that slider as well until they just disappear. As we do this, note how the histogram spreads out towards white or black, which is an indicator of greater dynamic range. Also watch for a peak at either extreme, since this is another sign of clipping. The reason we zero the exposure slider first is that exposure settings affect the maximum white and minimum black points, and other adjustments can often make a change in the exposure unnecessary. The exposure slider can be like using a sledgehammer to accomplish what other sliders do more delicately. I noticed while setting the black point that the water got a lot darker, and I would like to preserve those highlights, especially if I later convert to black and white. Exploring things with the highlight slider here doesn't seem to be much help with either the water or the sky, and turning up the overall exposure would defeat what we did previously. So I'm going to try a trick with the masking bug over on the left-hand margin. First, we'll zero out the highlights by double-clicking. When I click on the adjustable gradient icon over on the left, a local adjustment panel opens over on the right. And there we go. And now you can see the local adjustment panel here on the right, and it's simply saying adjustment. To remind you that any changes you make will be local to where you're using this adjustment tool. I'm going to turn up the exposure a bit on the adjustment tool so that we'll be able to see more easily what it is I'm doing. Then up at the top margin, I'm going to click on the shape drop down and change it from gradient to reflected gradient. As you'll see in a minute, this means I will be able to adjust the top and bottom feathering of this mask independently. I'm going to click near the middle of the water with this adjustable gradient mask. And because I've temporarily turned up the exposure quite high on this local adjustment, you can immediately see where the mask is located and what effect it's having. The maximum effect of this local adjustment will be visible between the two solid lines. There's one right here, and there's one right there. So I'm going to adjust the level of the top solid line down to approximately the level of the dock, and the bottom solid line to maybe an inch or so above the bottom of the photograph. Now I can drag the dotted lines independently to feather out the effect of this adjustment. At the top of the mask, I'll set the limit of the feather maybe around the top of the small windmill in the distance. There we go. Because I want to highlight those background features without lightening the sky too much. I'm going to set the bottom feather right at the bottom of the picture. Simply click on it and drag it down. Now I can go back to the exposure slider over on the right under this local adjustment panel and brighten the water to my taste. So I'm going to turn it down a good bit. I think I'll settle on 1 full stop brighter. That's one of the great things about a local adjustment. You can always go back later and change it. You can see the local effect if I turn this adjustment on and off by clicking this little orange icon. When I do that, I notice that the lower part of the building in the foreground has gotten a lot lighter than I would like it to be. So I'm going to readjust the local positioning of this mask. I'll start by dragging the top solid line down a bit more, and that's already done a much better job. And I think the top feathering is probably okay. Maybe increase it just a little bit, and the bottom feathering is just as I want it, and maybe we can pull the bottom solid line down a little bit. So there we've protected the building a little bit more without having to use a separate mask, just by dragging these lines in the adjustable gradient mask. Returning to overall settings, I'm going to open up the shadows slightly by taking the shadow slider a bit to the right here. Not too much, just open up those shadows a little bit under the windmill in the foreground. I might nudge up the midtones a bit as well, just slightly. Don't want to go too far with this. I'd like to spread out the histogram a bit more too, from left to right. So I'm going to use the contrast slider, because that's the slider that has this effect. But as I nudge the contrast slider to the right, the blacks begin to clip, so I don't want to go very far with this. And I know that later I will be applying a dynamic contrast filter in the effects module as well. For the same reason, I'm going to leave the structure slider untouched, but I'll demonstrate the effect it can have here by moving first one way to the right to increase structure, which is really local and mid-tone contrast, and also to the left to decrease structure, and then I'll zero it again. I think we've pretty much finished our tone adjustments in the Develop module, so let's do 1 or 2 things about color. Notice, though, that we made all these tone corrections without having to change the overall exposure slider. First, I want to warm up the image slightly. I remember this as a mostly sunny day, hence the wispy clouds. It was early spring, so I'll take the temperature slider up just a bit, say to around 49-50. Too much, and the clouds begin to take on an unappealing yellow tinge, as you can see here. So back to 49-50. Remember, it's not the numbers that matter, it's the effect you're seeing on the image and the effect that you want to get. Let's bring out the color a bit more now. If I increase the saturation slider, the orange in the windmills begins to look too hot, as you can see here. So I'll zero that out. And instead I'll bump up the vibrance, which affects only undersaturated colors. Let's see, to probably around 25 or so. Reduce it to 0 so that you can see the effect, and back up to around 25 or so. This seems to bring out the color in the roofs and the green trim as well as the blue in the sky, so I'm happy with it. I'm tempted to play with the haze slider, but I think I'll wait to adjust things further in the effects module. Finally, I'll add some capture sharpening to the image, so we'll scroll down to the details panel once more, and this time I'm going to select the low preset under sharpening, perhaps zeroing in to 100%, which is always a good idea when you're sharpening, and I'll pan to an area of the photograph that has some detail, such as the side panels of the buildings and the roof here. I'll turn the detail panel on and off, and you can see a subtle change in the sharpness. If you click on the masking slider and hold down the Alt key as you move the slider, you'll see the picture change to black and white, and anything that is in black will have the sharpening masked out. Anything that is in white is where the sharpening will appear. Well, I want the sharpening to spare the sky for sure, so I'm just going to adjust this very carefully to simply provide a little extra sharpness in the building. Now we'll zoom back out to fit. JPEGs come out of the camera pre-sharpened, but not so for raw files, so we need to account for that here. Note that we did noise reduction earlier. It's important to do these things in that order to avoid sharpening noise. Before we head on to the artistic effects, let's hit the backslash key and compare the original to where we are now. This is the original, and this is where we are now. Here's the original, here's where we are now. You can certainly see that the present view is a bit brighter, especially in the water, also a little bit in the sky, but we'll correct for that when we get to the effects module. And you could notice that structures like the buildings have taken on a bit more sharpness. This completes the initial post-processing for tone and color. While not exactly a recipe, I hope you can see that many of these steps are necessary, and in roughly the order I did them, to achieve a technically correct version of the image. I use the term technical in a loose way because your interpretation will differ from mine, but should still fall within the guidelines of acceptable practice. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Part 2, entitled Beyond the Recipe, will deal with the more artistic elements of post-processing this same image, and it includes a side trip into black and white. Please post your comments or suggestions for future topics. Check out our website at notchabovephodoclub.com and come visit us at one of the club's monthly meetings if you're near Bethlehem in the North Country of New Hampshire. I'm Tim Williams. Thanks for watching and have fun revealing your vision.